So it is good to have Jesse back. He said that he escaped from the north, so we're glad to have him back with us this morning. All right, we'll begin with our reading in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. The New King James Version first, and then we'll read again from the NIV. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to gain and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. What profit has the worker from that in which he labors? I have seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, and also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it, and nothing taken from it. God does it that men should fear before him. That which is has already been, and what is to be has already been. And God requires an account of what is past. Moreover, I saw under the sun, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. I said in my heart, concerning the condition of the sons of men, God tests them, that they may see that they themselves are like animals. For what happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. One thing befalls them. As one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals, for all is vanity. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and all return to dust. Who knows the spirit of the sons of men, which goes upward, and the spirit of the animal, which goes down to the earth? So I perceive that nothing is better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him? Okay, from the NIV. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What do workers gain from their toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it so that people will fear him. Whatever is has already been, and what will be has been before, and God will call the past to account. And I saw something else under the sun. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of justice, wickedness was there. I said to myself, God will bring into judgment both the righteous and the wicked, for there will be a time of every activity, a time to judge every deed. I also said to myself, as for humans, God tests them so that they may see that they are like the animals. Surely the fate of a human being is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so the other dies. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless. All go to the same place. All come from dust, and to dust all return. Who knows if the human spirit rises upward and if the spirit of the animal goes down into the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work, because that is their lot. For who can bring them to see what will happen after them? Okay, so our author entitles this section, "There is a season to every purpose under heaven." And the first portion of this has been popularized how? Especially for those older folks here. There was a song, right? It's in here. Is it The Birds? Is that who sang the song? And that now, so that it's a familiar. The first was 8 verses, 7 or 8, are very familiar. One because of that song, and we've heard it in other things. And I think that in a way that's good. That's an end we might be able to use sometime. You know, how we can take something that's been modernized like that and use it. Did you realize that's from the Bible? And start a discussion. You know, we can start there and talk about other things in the Bible. So I think it's good that we can use anything to our advantage like that as we can find that can help us to talk to others about the Bible and ultimately Christ. Well, Arthur begins here that we all like happily ever after stories. Why do we like happily ever after stories? They make us feel good. Yeah. Don't all of us always hope that good is going to overcome evil? You know, the guys, the cowboy in the white hat, you know, it's going to be the one that wins out. Yeah, it's just kind of the way that we would like things to turn out. But there in the last paragraph, he says, while suffering, on page 13 if you're in the book, while suffering makes us sad, injustice makes us mad. We long for fairness and equity, for life to be neat, nice, and tidy. But that's not reality. Sadly, if you live with injustice long enough, it's easy to become disillusioned and cynical when you don't have answers or explanations. That's what happened to Solomon. Cynicism has taken its toll. And we'll see that, again, it's kind of interesting the way this book reads, isn't it? It's like Solomon, he goes through something cynical, then it seems like he has a little moment of wisdom about something, then he goes right back to being cynical again. So it seems to be the pattern that we're seeing as we go through this. And we also seem to be seeing some themes. You know, we see repeated again, you know, some things, good things that he does see in life, and he repeats them again in this chapter that we saw in the last one. And in the discussion about time, I didn't realize that Benjamin Franklin said this. He said Benjamin Franklin defined time as the stuff of which life is made. And he makes the point that 2 points here, that everybody has the same amount and that our lives revolve around it. And that's true, isn't it? You think about how we view time. We're all on a schedule, aren't we? We're on a schedule. We have to be here at a certain time, be there at a certain time. And what do we call it? The rat race of life that we can get into just because we're tied to time. And in point B there on page 14, he says, why is time important? Because it is rare. Nothing is in demand more. Because it is irretrievable. Once gone, it is gone for good. And because it is fleeting. And he references James 4 there, where it talks about our life being like a vapor. Yeah, and you think about that. We've talked about that some. We've talked about that some at work. Back during COVID, they cut us by 20%. So we worked 80% for 80% pay during a bunch of COVID. But you know what? That Friday off sure was nice. And balancing, is that money? What's worth more, that extra day of pay or that extra day of time where I'm free to do what I want to do versus doing work stuff? It's just something we balance that off all the time, don't we? Because we have, as it says, with the fact that we all have the same amount in the sense that we've got the same amount of time every day, we have to make choices, don't we? We have to make choices about how we're going to use the time that God has given us. And we know we have responsibilities we deal with. We want to fit in a little bit of fun time to help us relax. We got family, we got friends, we got church, we got all things that need our attention, right? And we have to make decisions around how we're going to deal with that and make application of our time. And I think that's why a lot of times, in the context of Christianity, we talk about priorities, right? That as a Christian, we have to set our priorities appropriately. Is there anything wrong with recreation and things like that? Well, no, not as long as it doesn't take over, right? It doesn't become too high on our priority list. And what has to be our first priority? Easy answer, right? God, our brethren, the things that we're doing to serve God is to be first on our list. So now we go through these first several verses here, and we see all these, he calls them here time-measured events. And what do you see? How does Solomon give this to us? It's a bunch of contrast, isn't it? We've got birth and death. We've got planting and uprooting. We've got killing and healing, and so on as we go down through the list. So what is that telling us about life? Norma?
Naturally, built in is the idea of balance. There's a balance in life, and life will always seek balance. If you get off too far in one direction or another, the laws of creation will pull you to try to pull you back.
Okay. Anybody else? Todd?
I think it shows that you can't seek after one thing as if it's the answer. Like Solomon's been doing, I'm going to seek pleasure and all this, happiness or whatever. No, there's a time for the opposite, and that's going to be the right thing for that time.
And so, when we take this into consideration, and that this description here we see of life, does that help us to be prepared? Yeah, Norma.
And Solomon realized this. There was something to learn, and something of value to each of these, of the good and the bad. As a matter of fact, we learn. It seems that in life we learn more from that which is bad, if we're paying attention, to that which is good, which we tend to then get apathetic about and go, hey, put it on autopilot and let it roll.
And so how do we, then, as Christians, how do we put it in a perspective properly? Just take the first one. Time to give birth. Now, Robert and Lauren are anxiously awaiting Harper, right? We're excited. But then on the flip side, what about somebody that's at the end of their life? But Brother Newman kind of gave us some insight there. There can be anticipation there as well if your life is right with God, isn't it? So I think that's what we've talked about as we study this, and it seems that's what Solomon keeps remembering and forgetting. That this concept of if God is in your life, then one thing, you can deal with these things, right? You can understand that life is not always going to be the bed of roses or garden of roses, whatever we say. He discusses that. As a Christian, it's presented that what should we expect from the world? They'll hate us, persecution. Why is that? Because we stand against them. If we're standing against the world, then we should expect that we're going to receive, that the world's going to come after us, so to speak, when it comes to those kind of things. So as we think about, sometimes it's easy for us to get down when we're in some of the negatives that go on here, isn't it? And that's just kind of natural. Andy?
When we think about Solomon as the preacher that put out there, everything's vanity. I mean, he had everything that he could have ever wanted. And sometimes I think that we're kind of almost the same way, just because of the times that we live. there's nothing that we really can't have or get. And when we read here, what we see is that there's got to be a balance in life. And so we need to put that in perspective, that we have to balance these things out, otherwise we're just going to be miserable.
Yeah, good point. I think that's the whole. Again, that's what he's already shown us. He sought after everything fun, didn't he? Was that in chapter 2? Everything fun, he went and tried it. But what was his conclusion? He got bored, didn't he? He got bored after everything fun. And it's this balance, as we'll get to it in a minute. We see that he kind of keeps coming back to these few simple things that are fulfilling to man, as long as God is included. So does anybody have any further comments on the first 8 verses? On our times, Ken?
Every time I hear that phrase, I always think, you know what, there's thorns in that bed of roses too. So you have the good and the bad, right?
That's a good point. That's a good point. Anybody else? All right, so we move into verses, in verse 9 here. There's a couple of questions that Solomon is going through here. What profit has the worker from that in which he labors? I've seen the God-given task with which the men are to be occupied. So he kind of comes back to this thing about life, right? What is life? Where is life going? And he kind of, what do people get for their hard work? He seems to come to this question several times as we read through this, and we keep getting the same answer, though, that if God is not included, you really don't get nothing, do you? But if God is included, then even the simple things in life are good, and we can be satisfied with those with God in our life. And in verse 11, it says, He has made everything beautiful in its time, and He has put eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. And in the NIV, that one reads, He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. So what is he saying here? So what's the thing about He set eternity in the human heart? Jesse, you look like you want to say something.
Well, I just think the way that our Heavenly Father made us in His image, it's no accident that human beings know that there's something greater, more powerful, something more out there after this life is over. You know, even as Paul spoke and taught to those in Athens who didn't know the true God, that's one of the things he appealed to them in Acts 17 was, you know, that so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for Him and find Him, though He's not far from each one of us, for in Him we live, move, and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, for we are His offspring. And so there's something innate in us, the way He made us, that most people, I think, believe that. Mm-hmm. There's something.
Yeah, the way he puts it here, he says that we all have an eternal itch. And I thought that was an interesting way to think about it. And that's that nature within us. And to Jesse's point, even those that got way off base, which they got way off base, that there seems like there's always been a concept in all societies of something beyond, right? That there's some God or gods or there's something else out there. And that's exactly what he was going after when he talked to the folks there that Jesse read from in Acts. That we have that itch within us, and so but the only place we can get the answers for that itch are where? In God's Word, right? Go to God's Word, and with God's Word we have an understanding. He says there, no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Do we understand it all? No, but at least He gives us enough that He gives us perspective on it, doesn't He? And that if we abide in Him, then we can, as Brother Newman was preaching for us, we can anticipate that eternal itch, right? What it's going to bring us when we pass from this earth. We can look forward to it. And then he moves into the next section here, and then this is the repeat of what we've seen before. In verse 12 and 13, I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives, and that also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of his labor. It is the gift of God. Now he's back to having a little sense here, isn't he? And again, it's interesting where he sticks this kind of in after hunks of what he said before. So he goes through all these contrasts, right? All these different things that we can experience and are likely to experience at least some of them in our lives. And he kind of comes back to this conclusion, though, that, hey, the important thing is again, the simple things of life with God, isn't it? Just enjoy every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of his labor. It is the gift of God. And that's just kind of the simple things of life, isn't it? With God included. Solomon keeps concluding that's better than all these other things that he has tried in his life. Then in verse 14, I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it that men should fear before him. Why do you think that's important? And I think we have a question about that too. But why? I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it, nothing taken from it. It implies consistency, doesn't it? Well, why is it important to have a consistent God? You can depend on him. Yeah. What's one of the worst things that our folks that deal with child psychology and all that will say that a parent can do when it comes to discipline? Be inconsistent. If they do something and they get beat one time and they do it again and nothing happens, then they don't know what to expect. Now, is that the same way with us with God? No, right? We can count on him, whether it's in the positive or the negative, we can count on him not changing, right? Norm P?
That statement establishes him as the source of truth. I mean, if everything he does is eternal, and there's no contradiction, there's no shifting shadows, then if you are looking for the truth, that is the source. The thing that cannot be changed and does not change, that's the truth.
And again, that's important. That's something we can grab hold of, right? Now, we should fear it if we're in opposition to it, but we can count on it one way or the other, right? That he's going to do what he said, and he proves that over and over again. In verse 15, that which has already been, and that which is to be has already been, and God requires account of what is past. That's kind of the history repeats itself kind of thing we've seen before. But at the end of that, what is that telling us? God's paying attention, isn't he? That there's an account that's going to be given, whether it was way in the past folks were doing, or way in the future, or right now. That there's an account, and we can count on there being an account because he doesn't change. And that's something that consistency is good for us. Again, that we can count on that. Has anybody got any other comments on through verse 15? Andy?
In this section here, 9 through 15, in the New Testament, over in Acts chapter 17, and in verses 26 and 27, we see kind of a very similar thing here, in that we're always seeking something better. And so that better thing that we're seeking, of course, God, heaven, and so it's almost a parallel in there in Acts 17:26. It says, "He made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us.
That's that each again, isn't it? There's a seeking within us, and it should be after God.
And Jeff, I might add, just a little later after that, he ties in what you just talked about, Solomon, the judgment, the accounting, because he brings up the resurrection of Christ, but then the judgment day that's coming, the accounting day that's coming.
All right, anybody else on that section? All right, so now we move into verse 16, and now cynical Solomon shows back up. So what's the problem Solomon sees here in this section? He looks out, and what does he see? Injustice. That wickedness is prevailing. We ever feel that way? When we look out into our world? Absolutely, because that tends to be what we see, and a lot of times that tends to be what is brought before us, isn't it? When we look at things, who seems to get more rights, victims or criminals? Seems like the criminals get more. That's not right, and we see these things that we don't understand how there's justice. And the author makes a point here. If life isn't comfortable, at least we want it to be fair. But it's not, is it? That's the problem. That's kind of back to what we're talking about at the beginning, about the happily ever after stuff. If we feel like at least it works out, a thing that I think all of us have always said, the car comes flying by you in 30 going about 70, you're like, where's the cop? Where's the cop? Where's the cop when you need him? And we feel that, we have that sense of that justice should prevail within us. But unfortunately, we see that in real life, in this world, that doesn't always happen, does it? But when we pull it back again, where will justice ultimately prevail? Norway, in the judgment, that ultimately with God, that things will prevail. And then he gets into this, he goes into some big time cynicism toward the next few verses, right? Was he this comparison of men and animals? He's just kind of like, what's it worth? And I guess he's right in the physical sense here, correct? I mean, this isn't a false statement. What happens when animals die physically? They return to dust. What happens to us when we die physically? We return to dust. So physically, he's right here, obviously. But he does throw out this thing about, well, who knows about which the man's spirit goes up and animal spirits go down, or who really knows? In the end, we just all die. That's pretty much where he ends up here, isn't it? This is some serious cynicism from a guy who obviously knew better. From what he had received from God, he knew there was a God, and he knew there was more to it than this. But at this point, when he wrote this, obviously he was in a huge state of cynicism. So I like what the author says there in number 4, just kind of in how to overcome this. He says down at the bottom, but that's life. The real question is, will you determine to be different? Will you rise above the inequities? Will you choose the higher and better road? You cannot choose your circumstances or lot, as it says in some versions, but you can choose your response. That's a good point, isn't it? Our reaction to and response to the circumstances in our life determine a lot. And people see that as well, right? That we can be a great influence by the way that we deal with things in our life, and keeping ourselves grounded in God and His ways. And then he kind of ends again in verse 22. So I perceive that nothing is better than a man should rejoice in his own work, for that is his heritage. For who can bring bring him to see what will happen after him. In this case, I think he's still being cynical, though, after this argument. It's kind of like, this one's like, just enjoy yourself, but it's not, don't enjoy it. Don't worry about it too much, because you don't know what's going to happen to it once you die. And he's made that point multiple times. You know what? You could build up all this wealth, and no telling what your kids are going to do with it. And it's kind of interesting that we see the cynicism come back after he goes through the little argument of, well, all this is good with God, and now it's, well, just live your days out. When you're gone, somebody else will spend it for you. Anybody have any final comments before we get into the questions? Norm A. and then Todd.
In this chapter in particular, I sensed a lot of regret that there was a lot of wasted time, a lot of things that Solomon did in his life that now you can't get it back, you can't change. He's learned a whole bunch, and he's learned a whole bunch that he made a lot of mistakes, and you can't. When you go and you start living in the regret for that which you can't change, cynicism, you can't help but start being cynical about the whole thing and what's the use, and it's really it's one of the things that we need to avoid. Getting older, you start thinking about that mortality a lot more than you do when you're in your 20s, and you just can't help thinking. Before where you would plan for the next 10 years, now you think, well, wait a second, 10 years from now, I'll be how old? Wait a second. And so we really have to avoid that and keep the eternal in mind.
Mm-hmm. That's like Shirley's already told us there's no golden years, right? So we have to be without God. With God, we know there's golden years. So anybody else? Todd, I'm sorry.
Yeah, in verses 17 and 18, the New American Standard says, I said to myself, but in the margin it's, I said in my heart. I think it's good to recognize the blessing of these texts as a glimpse of, they're very honest in the sense of the way men feel. And sometimes we feel a certain way in our hearts, but you think if I was writing the scriptures, God would probably be guiding me to only record the things that, are true from his heart. But here God's allowing us to see the true feelings of man. And which of us could ever say we've never felt these ways, right? And they're misguided because they're forgetting God, but there may be a time where you feel like, what's the difference between me and my dead dog here? We're all going to go to the same place. But then it's the same way in the Psalms where people have those low moments, but then they remember God and they're brought out of those low moments.
Good point. All right. First question. Finish the conversation. I'll read the whole things in the book. He's out, shouted the umpire after a close play at the plate. I was safe, yelled the little ball player as he ran crying back to the dugout where he slumped against the fence and pouted about unfairness. When the coach had heard enough, he took the boy aside and said, I agree that you were safe. Then he added, I also agree it wasn't fair, but life isn't fair. And the follow-up question was, how will that scene replay itself throughout that boy's life, and how must he learn to respond? We already talked about you might be a victim of something in your life where you are totally innocent in the situation, but you get the worst end of it. If I think about and how many of us at work have quit? We see somebody gets promoted, and you're like, how did they get that? Why did they deserve that? Those are thoughts that come to our mind, isn't it? Well, I've got more time than them, or I've got a better background than they do. But it just happens, doesn't it? You see people that maybe they have an unfaithful spouse, and they did nothing to cause it, yet they have to deal with all of the heartache and what it does to children and all that because of a decision somebody else made. When somebody decides to drink and drive and hits somebody and kills somebody's family members, those are situations that they didn't have nothing to do with it, right? Nothing was their fault, yet it's not fair, but it happens. And the only way I think that we can truly deal with it is to include God, right? To include God in that, to realize that the world we live in is unfortunately dominated by sin, and sin makes things happen that aren't nice sometimes, and sometimes we have to deal with it. But fortunately, we have God to lean on. Anybody have anything else they want to say about that one? Norma?
Just that every situation, good or bad, something could be learned from it, and we need to look at each of those situations from that perspective. There's an eternity out there waiting, and if we're going to be piling up treasures in that, we have to keep that view in mind in the things that we're looking to learn from our situation.
Okay. All right, the next one. Life isn't defined by time as much as significant events that occur in life. So we've kind of gone through this. Does anybody have anything else they want to add to the 14 contrast that we noted? Okay, we'll go on through that one then. So what is the answer to Solomon's question in verse 9? So again, what profit has the worker from that in which he labors?
Not much, but spiritually, if you work like you're working for God, then you have, eternity to look forward to.
Okay. I remember. Go ahead.
Yeah, like even when it comes to witnessing to others, I mean, you see how you may be the one to sow the seed on the ground, and there may be someone who comes after you who reaps the harvest. I mean, you aren't even promised that with spiritual work as well. You just need to understand that there's a higher purpose to what you're doing. May not have an immediate satisfaction.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point, really good point from a spiritual side about not getting down. Right? We do our work, and we do what we're supposed to do, and we let God take care of other things. Right? It's not our fault if it don't necessarily work out like we hoped it would. That's a good point, Sam. Thank you. Anybody else? All right. Let's see. Number 4. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Compare Romans 8:28 along with the story of Job and Joseph and discuss how God can cause good to rise above evil. So what's Romans 8:28 say? Yeah, those that love God, he makes all things work together for good. What happened with Job and Joseph that shows how good rises above evil? Ken?
Well, Job, of course, God allowed Satan to tempt him and to take away everything he had, and he, of course, through it all, never cursed God, never blamed God for it. He, in fact, thanked God for what he had, and God ended up restoring everything he had in twofold. So, when we remain faithful to God, he will take care of us.
And then Joseph, it's interesting with him. Everything he did because he trusted God. The word it gets used is favor, and he found favor with God and man because of his dependence on God. So what's the? You ask the question: have you faced disappointing situations only to realize later it was actually a blessing? That's that 20/20 hindsight that sometimes we have, isn't it? That sometimes we don't understand why something is happening, but 5 years later, you were kind of look back and like, whew, that pointed us in a good direction, or helped us learn a lesson we needed to know, or at the very least, we can help someone go through the same thing we had to go through. Right? That we can use those things. Number 5, what gift of God does Solomon see in verses 12 and 13, and what truths about God does he discover in verse 14? So what was again, Norma?
There's certain works that God has predestined for us to do, and so if we do those, then we know we're on the right path. There may be a corner we can't see around right now, but God makes it so that we can, he's the one who can see around that next corner, and this gives us the trust in him to be able to do that.
Okay. Yeah, and it's that getting into that doing good, being happy, with God included. And then the second verse 14 there was the one about God's ways and his works enduring forever. And I thought I did want to add a couple more verses there. What is said about Jesus in Hebrews? That he's what? The same when? Yeah, that's that consistency again, right? That he's always the same. And then there was a couple of verses over in Malachi 3. In Malachi 3, verses 5 and 6 that I wanted to read. And it says, "And I will come near you for judgment. I will be a swift witness against sorcerers, against adulterers, against perjurers, against those who exploit wage earners and widows and orphans, against those who turn away an alien, because they do not fear me, says the Lord of hosts. For I am the Lord, I do not change, therefore you are not consumed, O sons of Jacob." Again, that point of, all of those in verse 5 are judgments, aren't they? And he's saying, I don't change. Those were wrong once, they're always going to be wrong. And that's that consistency that we can count on. We can count on what God says is wrong is always going to be wrong. What God says is right is always going to be right. And the blessings that we're promised will always be there. And that's good for us, that we can count on that consistency. Anybody have any other points they want to make on number 5? All right, question 6. What had the author observed in verse 16 that left him cynical, or what gave him hope in verse 17? Or me?
Satan has a hold on this world, death grip, but God is going to judge in the end, and so eternally God wins.
Yeah, this is the whole wickedness is beating justice. Evil is beating good that we see a lot, but irregardless, we can count on that ultimately God is going to judge. All right, so how do we know that the breath, spirit of man ascends upward? Because God says so. Well, where does God say so? Some examples. Yeah, go ahead and read that one, Ken.
Okay. Says, "And the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it."
Okay. Yeah, I thought about John 14, where Jesus is talking about where he, don't let your hearts be troubled. Why? Because in God's, I've prepared a place for you. I guess maybe that doesn't necessarily mean upward, but that's the way we look at it, right? We look at it going upward, but there's a place for us that's prepared after death, right? We go and read in 1 Corinthians 15, there's the big discussion about that, in the resurrection that we know, and that's that itch that's within us that it's there. And finally, the last one here, what is your unjust disadvantage? You have one. Everyone does. Bad health, struggling marriage, prodigal children, job demands, loneliness. What choices do you have regarding your attitude toward it? And what was Paul's decision regarding his personal difficulty? So what was Paul's attitude toward his thorn in the flesh? Norm P? Pray about it, get it removed. Excuse me? Pray about it, have it removed. Okay. And what was sufficient? Yeah. Well, he said he's weak. What in God? What did he say? Grace, right? That in other words, his sufficiency was in God, right? To go to him about that. Okay. Well, thank you. We'll continue with chapter 4 next week.